I got my I got my ear pierced summer between seventh and eighth grade, which was like a cool, edgy thing to do in whatever the 80s. But my mother, wouldn't let me wear earrings with like skulls or any kind of violent imagery. And if I went to like a Metallica show, I'd have to come home with a shirt that was not like, insanely violent imagery, or I would have
That's
heard grief from my mother.
Yeah, that's Cassingles.
So, what piece of advice would you give your high school self if you could go back? Like, what's one thing that you would tell your high school self if you could?
Appreciate more.
Deep.
Yeah, like I know it sounds deep, but it's not even all that deep. Like take a moment to just like realize that cool things are actually happening and that good information is coming in, school or not, and just appreciate more about the things around me and be less selfish.
I like that. I think the same vein as like appreciate more. I would tell myself like to just slow down and enjoy the moment because I struggle. I struggle even now, but I really struggled then. Everything seemed like I was doing it for something to come. And so I had a really hard time just enjoying what was in that moment because it always seemed like there was some other pressure, some other thing that I was working towards or doing things to or waiting for, like there was something big. So I think that looking at our guests today, one of the great things is how they were able to come back together after so long.
21 years.
21 years, and kind of relook at their music and put out a brand new album, which is great because we get to interview Dave Lake from Diesel Boy, which is amazing.
My high school self is just screaming songs in the hallways right now. Titty Twister is the loudest thing in Wilson High School.
My husband's dying. So I'm Courtney Dawn.
And I'm Chris Margolin.
And this is Cassingles.
Enjoy the ride, guys.
It's going to be a wild one.
Can you hear us all right?
I can.
Perfect.
Right.
Well, thank you so much for hopping on and hanging out with us today on Cassingles.
You're welcome.
We'll get right into it.
This is Chris.
I'm Chris, and this is Courtney.
Well,
Hello.
Hi. It's been a race to get the dogs settled this morning and coffee in hand this morning. So it's been.
I've got my coffee as well, and my teenagers are still sleeping, so not much to do to get them settled. Yeah.
Just woke ours up. She's in Cinderella, and they have their final show today. So we had to get her up and get her started for playing the mouse today.
Nice.
So, we like to start off by talking about the fact that we definitely know the Diesel Boy legacy. We grew up in the 90s. Definitely, I grew up screaming your songs in the hallways in school.
Thank you.
And absolutely, thank you.
yes.
But what we don't know is kind of how the whole legend starts. So who are you at 5 years old, 6 years old, when you are kind of entering the school world? Are you the rambunctious type, or are you the I'm ready for school and I can't wait to devour everything the teacher has to say type?
I'm somewhere in between those two things, I guess. I was not especially rambunctious, I would say, nor especially studious. I mean, I was a good boy. I'm like an only child, Jewish parents, definitely wanted to,
Oh, we ran the same line there. So.
definitely wanted to, be a good boy and make my parents proud and all that. So, I think my rebelling, getting into punk rock and metal, that was like a subtle way that I could rebel as a, adolescent and teenager, but not so much in my personality, maybe at least in my school age years. Like I got my ear pierced summer between seventh and eighth grade, which was like a cool, edgy thing to do in whatever the 80s. But my mother, wouldn't let me wear earrings with like skulls or any kind of violent imagery. And if I went to like a Metallica show, I'd have to come home with a shirt that was not like, insanely violent imagery, or I would have heard grief from my mother. Um, and I enjoyed school fine. I spent most of junior high and high school at a private school on the west side of LA. So it was like kind of ritzy, sons and daughters of rock stars and movie stars and movie directors. And it was a cool bunch of kids. And it was very progressive and cool. And so it was not it was very forward thinking. We called our teachers by their first names. Um, and the class size was real small. There was 41 kids in my graduating class. So it was definitely an environment where, um, artistic expression was favored. And, I was in jazz band for many years at that school. And so got to, evolve my musical education. They would always let us do one rock song every, semester or whatever. And then we would fight over who got the PV amp with the good distortion so that when we kicked into our solo, you could we were all into metal. So it was like we'd be playing some jazz song and then the solo section would come and you'd kick on the distortion pedal and just rip into some, metal-esque solo, and you could just see our teacher's blood pressure start to boil as we would do it. So
That's awesome.
How early did you kind of feel like music was not only something you did at school, but music was going to be that thing that you did?
I don't really know. I mean, I was always into music as a kid, and I, listened to the radio constantly. And I had a stereo in my bedroom. As an only child, I spent a lot of time sort of entertaining myself. So part of that was I would record songs off the radio on my tape deck that I liked, and then I would, dub cassette to cassette, which was how we sort of shared music back in the day.
Love that.
I lived in a neighborhood where a block away there was like a, sort of commercial center, and there was a record store, a warehouse, which was a chain of record stores in the, 50 years ago or 40 years ago. And so I think music was just always around. Later on, once I started buying music and, having physical media, I would definitely pour over all of the details of the, J card and the cassettes, or on the, read the back of my parents' record collection. So I don't think I had a sense that like music was going to be my thing necessarily. It was just around. My dad like dabbled, and when I was really young, he had a guitar in the house, but I didn't have much interest. I mostly remember thinking the case was so soft, and I used to like try and like want to like a cat like lay in the case and sort of rub my cheeks against the velvet material. And then he later sold that and got this keyboard, this sequential circuits keyboard that you could like multi-track on, and I would play around with that every once in a while. And I took guitar lessons a few times, but I don't know that I ever thought music was going to be my thing. I was never a good musician, right? I was okay, but my peers were always much, much, more talented players. In that jazz band class that I was in high school, there was like jazz band one, jazz band two, and so I think I spent 1 year in the first class and then 2 years in the second class. And in that second class, the guys were total rippers. Like these were guys that would like spend all day just practicing their scales, like really, really good musicians. I was like the worst guy in the class, but it was a cool place to be because you got to learn. And, everybody was nice. It wasn't like I was being ridiculed for my abilities, but you really got, these were the guys who were going to have a future in music. It wasn't me. These guys were like shredders at like 16. They were like killer players.
But then how does Diesel Boy become Diesel Boy then? How do you find your pathway from 2 years in level two jazz band and watching guys next to you who are the shredders? How do you find your way into songwriting yourself?
I think there was, I guess the first part is that I had, goofed around with friends at various times who were musicians, and they would set up drums and I would, play guitar, and we would fumble our way through metal songs or whatever. And then in high school, a bunch of my like best friends had a band, like a legit band that was playing at like the Roxy and the Whiskey and the Troubadour in high school.
Damn, that's huge. Yeah.
And and they had a big following because they were like kids in high school had a band, and so all the kids in all of our high schools, the surrounding high schools would go because it was cool that there were like these four kids who were like that they were like kind of like a funk punk Chili Peppers kind of thing, and so it was very sort of the late 80s, early
Yeah.
90s. Um, and me and some of those guys had a band where we never played out, but we would goof around like we played at the like high school talent shows and we would, we wrote songs. We weren't trying to be good. We were mostly just trying to be goofy. We were called Punkus Funkus. And, and so I had like, very limited kind of playing experience, but I sort of understood what it meant to kind of, be in a band in loosely in quotes. And then so I think there was something about the experience of watching all my good friends have success at an early age. And they all decided, these kids were a year younger than me. So I graduated, went to college, and then the next year, they had figured out that this was in Southern California, they figured out that if they applied to Berkeley, not Berkeley College of Music, but Cal,
Okay.
in Berkeley, California, that if they applied as forestry majors, that was the easiest to get into. So they all applied as forestry majors to Berkeley, and three out of the four of them got in. The fourth one went to
Oh
community
my God.
college, and so they had decided that they were going to like pursue this dream and try and sort of make it. So they all left and went to Northern California to try and sort of find success. And so I think there was something in there about jealousy is not right because I was happy for them. It was fun. And, I appreciated their success, but, I had something to prove to them or not to them, but to myself, I guess, really, that I could do it too.
Right.
And so at college, I became involved with the college radio station. My first year, I just saw that there was a class and I was like, oh, that sounds cool. Um, and so I became a
I gotta ask, did you have a signature song?
I did not. No, not really. Um, so I started as a DJ and then worked my way up to being the music director, and that got me in touch with, I started communicating with labels and kind of really getting involved kind of more directly in the music business. That led to me having internships at places like Epitaph and Fat and um,
Kind of the
I
very, very early days of everything. That's
yeah, absolutely, for sure. Yep. And so at some point in that class, there was another guy who we had the most kind of similar taste, and we found some overlap in our taste. And he was a bass player, and I don't know how it came up, but we were like, yeah, let's start a band. And so that was like sort of the very earliest version of Diesel Boy.
nice.
That's wonderful. I
Yeah.
love how those early connections then served all the way through.
We were quite a few years away from high school, so that's which is impressive. Like it's crazy to look back. Like I started playing music out when I was 13, and so it's crazy to look back and think 30 plus years of playing and releasing songs, and you guys have really, I mean, truly gone from those funny, like super sardonic, heavy-handed, like humor days to, almost a really interesting way to kind of give yourself a like a postscript memoir with the new album, which is pretty cool.
Thanks.
Along in that early time, who were how did your parents feel when you did kind of pursue music a bit more, full time? Uh, did you finish college and then do music, or and how did they feel about that?
I did finish college. As I said, I was going to college, and so one summer I had talked my way into a job or an internship at Epitaph. And this was when at some point, my parents moved from Southern California to Northern California to be closer to me where I was going to college. But so one summer before they had moved, I was down there. It was probably must I'm thinking it was between maybe my junior and senior year or sophomore, and it must have been junior and senior year. So Epitaph hadn't yet, like the Offspring hadn't broke. They were still in their first location. Basically everything was in one space. So they had an office and a warehouse all in one space in Hollywood. And so, you know, I worked for Jeff Abarta, who is famous for being the Jeff of Jeff Wears Birkenstocks song by NoFX. And there was maybe 8 or 10 employees there at the time, and Brett was there, and it was all in one room. There was no cubicles, and so everything was happening. And so I would come in and I don't know, go through fanzines and Xerox copies for bands for their press kit, or make sure that record stores had posters for upcoming gigs. And Fletcher would come in and pick up the stapler and staple his arm with the stapler, and
So he really is as crazy as he comes off on on every video
a-
of him. It's not just a publicity
absolutely,
stuff.
yes, it's how he's always been this way. um and so I assumed that I would work in the music business, and so that was kind of my goal. I mean, I don't know, it's kind of silly to think I could have hustled a living working at, Epitaph or, some label, but, people did. And then
Yeah.
later on, so the next year, I did the same thing at Fat. And so I would travel down and, intern there. They had never had an intern before. I remember talking to Erin, and she's like, we've never had an intern, but, I guess we can find something for you to do.
Sweet.
And so I thought that would be my path, would just be, I had a band, but I didn't think anything would come of it really. Um, and so my parents were surprisingly supportive. I think they understood that, um, Fat Records was once it came down to, us being able to make a record for that label and have that support. I think they understood that there was, it wasn't like, up until that point, I wouldn't have made a decision to try and pursue it because there wasn't really anything to pursue. We were hustling, and we would
Right.
book little tours for ourselves, and we were doing well. But in order to pursue it, like I literally had to do, I had to all do nothing and just go on tour and start doing it and make a record. And so, but I think because there were all those opportunities, it wasn't like I was just going to be like, all right, well, I'm going to try and, do a band. It was like the band had an opportunity. We got signed to a good label, and we were going to go on tour and make a record and kind of do the thing. And so, I think they eventually were putting more pressure on me, years down the road, when it was sort of like, you know, uh, I guess it kind of plateaued, or it was clear, I could probably do this forever, but, at what cost,
Right.
And I had
Well,
those same pressures and questions for myself.
When you think back to that time period, are there some songs that are playing or inspired you around that time period that you, when you think back to those times, play in your head or remind you
About
of that time
per-
period?
it being in college.
Uh-huh.
Um, well, I hadn't been exposed to punk rock until I went to college. So, I grew up, like Duran Duran was my first favorite band, and I was obsessed with Duran Duran. I had a
Love it.
painter's hat with I collected their pins, and I covered it in
yes.
pins.
Oh, I love that.
Um, and I was obsessed with Duran Duran. They were like my first favorite band. I was like a early Duran Duran super fan. And then like in middle school, I got super turned on to somebody showed me Shout at the Devil, and I was like looked at the cover and was like, are these boys or girls? Like, what is this? I don't know what it is, but I like it. And it was like leather, and it was like confusing and
In the
but
best
kind of
way.
dangerous.
Yes.
Anyway, so I didn't really know about punk rock. And then my freshman year of college, I had this roommate who was also named Dave, which was super annoying. But he was a punk. And so he turned me on to Bad Religion. He played me Bad Religion Against the Grain. And I was just sort of like, wow, like this is amazing. Like it has all the melody that I like. It's fast. So it kind of had an edginess or an aggression that was similar to metal, even though it didn't sound like that. But there were like these 3-part harmonies. And so I was off to the races. Like Bad Religion was my sort of gateway drug into the rest of it. And he also loved the Descendants. He had Descendant Summary. We listened to that a ton. And, I was aware of the Misfits because the Metallica had covered
Right.
Misfits, but I hadn't really listened to them much. And so he turned me on to like Ramones, Misfits, Bad Religion, Green Day, who had maybe their first record out. And so he was kind of my entry into punk rock.
Love
So
it.
those would be the bands. I don't know, particular songs, but those records are probably the ones that were sort of most influential in my earliest days.
Well, and I know obviously it's the early days of No Effects and the early days of all these bands. So that nobody at that time had kind of the legacy. But when you were as an intern at both Epitaph and Fat, do you see the future of punk there? I mean, what do you see when you're there? Does it look like something that is going to be a continuous, you know, push forth in music?
I don't think I had the I just don't think I was thinking that way. No, I mean I I don't think I don't think anybody was thinking about legacy or their legacy or any of that stuff. I mean, it was clearly, the operations were very similar. Mike modeled Fat after Epitaph because, that was what he knew and that was the label they were on. It was run by an artist, it was artist friendly. And, the people who worked at both places were just like dudes who would have been fans. And, it was not a traditional workplace, but everybody worked hard and everybody was passionate about what they were doing. So, I could see, oh, there's something here. And this, at the time, both of those labels were the shit, like they were
Yeah,
both like, you know, um, putting out great stuff. And, they tapped into something where they both had a style and a sound that was unique to that thing. And it was just working, at that, very of the moment. But I think hard to think about, well, what is this going to be in 10 years or
yeah,
15 years? The bands were doing well, but not well like they are, like they did, later on.
right. It's fascinating. You look at the label, excuse me, like the label, not wars, because it felt like a community, but between Victory Records and all these other the independent metal record labels that came out, the punk record labels that came out, you knew the label names. And that was something that I don't think anybody really thinks about anymore. I mean, I don't, you don't know who's signed to what label at all. And there was such an identity that came with being a part of those labels at the times. And like those the epic, like, when you would get one of their wow, I can't think of names now. When you can get
Punkorama.
yeah, when you get the Punkorama, Punkorama albums or any of those, and you really felt like you were listening to a family event. Like you could
Hmm.
crank that up at a party and you were with those bands at that party, and that was so much fun. We grew up in Portland, and so for us, La Luna was home to every punk band that came through.
Everybody.
So, I know we were both, even at 13, 14 years old, there
Well, before they should have been.
too many nights a week. So we got to really, be invested in kind of the punk rock culture at the time, which was pretty amazing. Um, I mean, it was a cool, like, being a high schooler in the 90s was a lot of fun because the cliques allowed you to separate and things. And like, I remember my clique was the hallway crew, and we had a boombox with us that was playing, Pennywise and NoFX and Diesel Boy, and pissing off every teacher who had a door opened anywhere at school at all. um when you were as a student, I know it was a small school, but did you feel that there was, a real place for you and your personality?
Yeah, it was because it was a smaller school. We didn't get to break off into like the punks or the metalheads or the, stoners or the goths. It was kind of like all the musicians and the creative types were like a crew. And so not everyone was a musician, but most were, but everybody was. And at that time, not everybody was expressing themselves in the way that they would later. But yeah, I mean, there was definitely, there were like the jocks and who the guys who were into sports and who followed, baseball and football and, and yeah, so I guess I was like with the musician crew or the music crew. But and then there were like, the nerds who are like, really into history and school and studying and all that kind of, who are like in neither of those things. And there were probably a few weird other factions, but because it was like a small school and everyone liked each other, the cliques would definitely intermix, but not, not in a, not on the weekends or outside of school, but everybody was friendly. There wasn't like, nobody was getting beat up or, it wasn't like a, you know, I, I don't know that there was a ton of pressure to conform to one of those groups, but we definitely had kind of a clique and a crew. It
That
just
sounds like a
wasn't
lovely
so
culture.
specific, to a genre or something like, my friends would give me shit because I was the only one who liked Cinderella and Motley Crue and, and they were like, hated that stuff or,
Which is
thought
crazy
it was
because if they
cheesy.
really listen to the music of it, a real jazz musician might like look at the scales that they're playing, look at the way they're playing. It's pretty magical sometimes.
Yeah. But they were all into, the Chili Peppers and Fishbone and Primus and, uh, so, that was one area where we diverged, but, but they were still accepting, even though I had, shitty musical taste.
Well, one of the things that we do here on the pod is so I have a brain injury and I wasn't able to listen to a lot of music during the last few years while I was recovering. And so it's kind of a really neat thing for me to, with every artist, I get to kind of immerse myself in your music um, and listen to it like it's kind of the first time again because I literally like don't remember music. Um, a lot of it from before my injury. So it's this kind of really beautiful thing for me to like get to hear your music almost like for the first time. So it was really lovely to know that I've heard your music from like my childhood, but then kind of get to re-experience it for the first time again. And then I'm a form.
Can I ask a
Yeah,
question about that?
yeah.
Uh, is there any sense of like deja vu, or is it clearly like,
Good question.
you say you've listened to it, but is that all, or once you get in there, does, I mean, I don't know much
No,
about,
it's weird.
brain injuries, but I'm just
So
curious.
no, thank you for asking. So I'm autistic, so I have like almost like synesthesia in kind of weird ways. So I experience music on like a multi-sensory level. And with my brain injury, it's like some music all of a sudden like I know every fucking word, like all of it. It will just pour out in this weird way. So like some of your songs,
Even though you didn't know that you've heard it, it just sort of triggers
yes.
something and you're like, it
Uh-huh.
unlocks something.
Which is real weird for like rap, like where
Mm.
all of a sudden I know like every single word and I can just like spit
And
everything.
she'll do it with a guitar too. She could pick
Uh-huh.
up a guitar and be and all of a sudden play a song that she literally has not heard in 25 years.
Yeah, and it'll just I just all of a sudden know it.
Huh.
And um or like a melody, especially if it's something that has been like layered on top of something else. I'll be like, no, I know that. And then a totally other song come on and I'll be like, oh, well, that was stolen from somewhere else and put there.
Mm.
That feels weird too.
Interesting.
Um and I can like music kind of plays in colors and stuff for me too. So it turns into kind of a really weird, fun experience for me to get to hear everything again. And it's almost like a guessing game. Like, did I know it? Maybe. Yep, kind of, sort of. So like the intellectual side of me will be like, no, I'm pretty sure I knew that. And then the other side of me is like, well, maybe, kind of, yeah, sort of. But it's really fun. And then being a former educator, um, I put together like as I'm listening, how could I use this in a classroom or with just students of any
Did you
kind?
ever think Diesel Boy would be used in the classroom?
No.
Well, it is
I,
now.
I'm still the educator, so I get to get these lessons.
And so as I was listening, the first song, oh, it's so funny. I'm getting so old. I can't even read my own writing. The first song well, not necessarily the first song, but the one that triggered like I could use this in a classroom was Real Life in the Big City. And so as I was listening to it, there's this kind of sense of like loneliness and like some isolation and feeling a sense of like wanting connection. And so as I was playing this song, I would just ask kids or students of any, you can do it with any age, to start thinking about a time where they felt lonely or left out or isolated. And then as a teacher, I'd share just a personal example of that, just to kind of trigger people into feeling safer in sharing their own example, and then have them just jot it down or think about it, share it out in a small group. Um, but then after that, and they'd shared and felt safe in it, I would share your second song, Lost Decade. There's this like amazing contrast between those two songs. Um, and I loved in that second song listening to you guys talk about going out and like becoming different people almost. And it sounded like almost listening to someone become whole people. And I don't mean that you weren't whole people before, but as somebody who's in my mid 40s now, um, and grew up with your music, it's like this sense of I've become such a much more full person now, having had jobs, lost jobs, had a child, and then coming back into relationships from high school, being such a better friend and person that I think I make such a better just community member in general. I'm not in band other than just with my husband here, but uh, I can see myself entering back into a relationship like that as just such a better partner in that. So it just made me feel like looking at having people just look at those two songs together and how might people be entering back into that as different people in such a better way. Um, and so then have them looking at that, how could these people have shifted? Why might the tone of that song had shifted? um, what might the people be singing about? And then having the students then look at what kind of systems do we have in place that might be leaving us feeling that kind of isolation right now in general. And what could we do about it? How can we kind of envision a different way of doing those systems? And those systems could be little, just tiny things that leave us feeling isolated or big giant things. But what do we do to move that forward? And then have them work in groups to create kind of a group image since we're looking at groups. And so here's what mine looks like. And we'll send this to you since I know this probably isn't going to come across very well. So I just did one with education. And it started as a path, but then it kind of looked like a wall. So, and then just what
Cool.
different pieces. And that's kind of quick little lesson that I do in a classroom.
That's awesome.
And there you are.
And then,
Thank you.
Yeah.
well, and then we like to transition that into, as we move toward the end here, if you look back on the Diesel Boy catalog, is there a Diesel Boy song that you think would leave some type of, even if it's silly, funny, wholesome, angry, whatever, some type of life lesson for that next generation, for your kids' generation? Is there a song that you think, looking back on it, that you think left a good lesson for the future?
I mean, that's when you reached out about this, I did kind of go through in my head and think about our catalog, and I could make a case for a couple of songs, but as in general, we're definitely not. If there's the only modicum of being like a teaching band would be what Matt Bayless, who produced our last record, called our Wikipedia songs. Like, there's definitely songs like sort of later on in our catalog where it was like a laundry list of girls I wanted to sleep with, or on the case of our of Gets Old, our latest record, there's a song called The Turk, which is sort of like there was this chess playing automaton, and I sort of went deep into the sort of history of that. And so, like, there might be some like historical lessons, but I don't know about life lessons. I mean, I think there is some truth in, Lost Decade being about, because we hadn't been playing for 20 years, I felt like we owed it to those people who might come back and listen to explain what we've been doing and why we had been gone for so long. And certainly I agree with what you said, that we returned as different people because we'd had a life outside of music, and we had families, and we didn't play in a band, and we, got married and got divorced, or, all the things that happened, and that's important, between, I don't know, late 20s and, early 40s or whatever. I guess the closest, there's a song on the record called Dirty Dishes on Gets Old, which is about my divorce. And, I suppose, the summary of the song is that it's sort of, there's two sides to the story, and there's my side and my ex-wife's side, and that ultimately it's not those things that matter. It's like sort of what happens to the kids and how we deal with that. And so, that was, I guess, a lesson that I was, going through or teaching myself, or, just an experience of, getting divorced and having kids. And so I think that's probably maybe the closest, if there's, I think more so than being, hopefully there are, like moments of wisdom or something I can impart that seems, deep or profound, or, emotional. Maybe deep and profound are too much of a stretch, but something emotional, I'm kind of, I tend to shy away, or at least I have for much of my writing, from revealing too much about myself in those ways. I will often couch it in, singing from another character's point of view, or just, being a smart ass. And, I try, I think it's important and I think it's good. But it's vulnerable. And I don't tend to do it a lot, which is, a conversation, I guess, for another day. But, I loved the way you put the thread together. And, I think the things that you said, loneliness is definitely something that I write about a lot and that I think comes through, not always intentionally, but, it's a feeling that I have a lot, as an only child and as a divorced dad, and my kids are about to go away to college. I mean, there's, for whatever reasons, there is a loneliness that just sort of lives inside of me, and that comes out a lot. And so, um, and if I'm strumming through something I'm working on, I'm scatting along, just kind of making up words. I'm not scatting. I mean, I'm singing words, but a lot of times the phrases that come out, I'm not thinking, I'm just doing. And so often they're, you know, a reflection of, some, they don't always stay in the song, but a lot of the lines that I'm singing, I realize I'm like, oh, I'm singing about, missing something or being lonely or whatever. So it's weird how that is just a thing that's just sort of like an anchor across all of it, whether I want it to be or not.
I think sometimes that common thread, it's something I tend to pick up through people's work for whatever reason. That's one of my I think autistic superpowers is
Mm.
that pattern and seeing through. Um, so I think that is a good message. It doesn't have to be like your whole message with music, but I think that might be your vulnerability superpower is letting that show through. And thank you for sharing that with us. That's a really powerful message because I think a lot of us deal with loneliness, especially in this day and age. It's a really hard thing, and it's a powerful thing to express um, in your music, that vulnerability and want for connection, because
I,
especially in this day and age.
I think there are probably bands with whose lyrical content is different from Diesel Boys, who probably have a lot of people saying, oh my God, your music saved my life, or, I couldn't have made it through without that. Diesel Boys not that kind of band, really. Not that our music hasn't moved people or meant something to people, but I don't think the general association with my band is that kind of thing. Usually it was like, dude, we played your song. We were every party in college. Like, dude, it's like a represents something else. And I do often feel like, oh, there is some piece of me that feels like the serious songs, or the ones that feel like important, or where I'm revealing something, are often not, getting that, they're getting lost in the void. So I don't think they really are, but people aren't necessarily talking to me about that stuff as much as like, did you ever meet Drew Barrymore, or, whatever it is.
I want you to know those are the ones I caught and saw your heart in. So I really
Thank you.
appreciated those. And I loved them. So thank you so much for being with us
Yeah,
today.
thank you
Yeah, of
so
course.
much.
I really appreciated you, and we appreciate your music, and we appreciate all of it. Like, we screamed everything in the halls at school, and we loved your more serious
It's been a
things.
lot of fun dancing around Disney the last few days at the house.
It really has. We've
Thank
had a
you.
Good
blast.
time.
Thank
Well,
you.
and
I appreciate it.
you'll get to see some more of it as we'll have
Thanks for listening and following along. We'll be back soon with more stories and songs. That's Cassingles. That's Cassingles. Yeah, that's Cassingles.